Hey Optimancers, Chris here. I've been analyzing the subclasses and optional class features for Tasha's for a couple months now. Today we're going to deep dive Feat first. Yes, the one thing Tasha's gave us a lot of was Feats, and I was really impressed by this part of the book actually, as there are a lot of great options for characters that are distinct from the other Feat options available up to now. So I'll be going through all the Feats in Tasha's. I'm going to be analyzing them, and then I'm going to rank them using my color ranking system. But before we do that, I want to take a minute and thank some of the fine folks who support this channel. My patrons enjoy benefits such as early release ad-free versions of these videos, and my top level patrons can join me for a game of D&D every month. Today, I'd like to thank Airhead, Awesome Face, Ben Potts, Bloody Nine, CJ, Caspern, Christian Wyndham, Comfy Baphomet, Douglas Reynolds, and Dash Panther. Thank you so much for continuing to support what I do here. Let's get started. Before we start going through the feats, first I'd like to differentiate what we call full feats from what we call half feats. Generally, a feat is chosen in place of an ability score increase, so you're giving up an opportunity to increase the ability score of your choice by 2 in order to get the feat. The exception to this would be the bonus feat given to variant humans and custom lineages at first level. So for the most part, for a feat to be worth grabbing, it needs to be better than that +2 ability score boost. No matter what your class, there's a pretty good chance that a +2 to your primary ability score is going to be pretty good, so a feat really needs to deliver for this to be worth the switch. There's an exception to this rule though, and that comes with half feats. A half feat basically keeps half the ability score boost, and typically gives you a feat benefit that, in theory, should be about half as good as a full feat. Now if your most important ability score is an odd number, this becomes a pretty great deal, because mechanically there's really almost no difference between an odd ability score and an ability score that's lower by 1. There's so little difference, in fact, I've often wondered why we bother with ability scores at all and don't just use the bonus instead. But that's a rabbit hole I'm not going to go down right now. Instead, let's just acknowledge that if I have a 17 dexterity, bumping it up to an 18 with a half feat is likely going to be a much better deal than bumping it up to 19 with a +2, as long as the feat benefits are significant at all. And I'm bringing this up because in Tasha's we have a lot of half feats. In fact, of the 15 new feats, 2/3 of them are half feats. Now we've had half feats before, though they were pretty hit and miss in terms of value, and there was a lot less of them to choose from. Also, there were a lot more options for half feats that boosted physical ability scores than mental ones. But in Tasha's, again, we have really boosted these options. So when I analyze a half feat, I'm really only looking for it to be half as good as a whole feat to be worth considering, and to rate decently. That brings us to our ratings. So if I rank something blue, that's my highest rank. If I rank something blue, I consider it to be a fantastic investment. If a blue feat fits my build, I'm pretty much always going to choose it over the +2 to my primary ability score. My second highest ranking is green. If I rank a feat green, I consider it a good choice. You can likely live without it, but it's probably never going to be something you're going to regret investing in. If I rank a feat purple, I think it's okay. Honestly, I think this is where I'd put the +2 ability score increase as well. So if a feat is purple, you're probably okay taking it over the +2, but maybe not any better off. If I rank a feat orange, I think it might be circumstantially okay. Maybe it needs to fit with another feat or on a certain build, but for the most part, I probably would stay away. And if I rank a feat red, I just don't think it's worth taking. Not saying it's useless. I mean, 3 skill proficiencies is fine. I'm just not taking the skilled feat in order to get it. As always, if you're colorblind, I'll be putting some stars after the feat ranking. 1 for red, 2 for orange, 3 for purple, 4 for green, and 5 for blue. I'll also actually be saying what the ranking is, so if you're just listening, you'll know what the ranking is. I'm going to start with the full feats, and then I'm going to come back with the half feats afterwards. And the first full feat I want to talk about is Artificer Initiate. This is basically the way to include Artificer with the other spellcasting classes available through the Magic Initiate feat. So this is no surprise to see here. As with Magic Initiate, we'll be learning a first level spell from the Artificer list, and we can cast it once per long rest without expending a spell slot. And as with Artificers, the casting ability is Intelligence. The wording is clearer here than it is with Magic Initiate, that you can cast the spell using a spell slot as well. Now this is the case with Magic Initiate as well, but you have to have levels in the class that could normally select the spell, though it was not really clearly stated at all and required sage advice to clarify. You only learn one cantrip from the Artificer list, which is a shame because Artificers actually have a good cantrip list. The Magic Initiate feat gives you 2 cantrips, but the reason it's only giving you 1 cantrip is likely to provide the tool proficiency. That can be in the artisan tool of your choice, and this can also be used as a spellcasting focus for any spell that has intelligence as its spellcasting ability. So the question is, who would take this over Magic Initiate Wizard? Because it's the same ability score, but the Wizard spell list is way bigger and better, and you get 2 cantrips instead of 1. And the answer would be maybe a Wizard themselves, especially a Wizard that dipped Artificer. One of the challenges of this multi-class is the juggling of tools required for casting Artificer spells and switching to the focus or one free hand for casting Wizard spells. I should point out, however, that a spell that has no material component is still going to require a free hand, unless you have the Warcaster feat, which already now has us up to 2 feats. I should also point out that Thieves' tools are not Artisan's tools, so they don't qualify for this feat, in case you thought your Arcane Trickster would be using Thieves' tools for an Arcane Focus for this feat. They're not. So overall, I think this one falls short of the okay feat of Magic Initiate, and except in very specific circumstances, not a feat I'm going to lean towards. So I'm going to rate it orange, a bit weak in my opinion, unless you need these tools as a focus. That brings us to our next whole feat, which is Eldritch Adept, and this one allows you to pick an invocation from the Warlock class, even if you aren't a Warlock. The limitation here is really significant though. If an invocation has a prerequisite of any kind, you cannot select it unless you're a Warlock who meets the prerequisite. So, for example, let's say you got Eldritch Blast without taking a level of Warlock. Maybe you took Magic Initiate or Spell Sniper, or you got it through a magic item or something. This feat would not allow you to access any of the invocations that improve Eldritch Blast, even though you meet the prerequisite. And this really limits the value of this feat. Now, if you have 2 or more levels of Warlock, I just don't think this is worth it. I mean, I always want more invocations as a Warlock, but 1 more invocation for an entire feat slot, that's just too expensive. If you aren't a Warlock, you have a pretty limited list. Armor of Shadows, Beach Speech, Beguiling Influence, Devil's Sight, Eldritch Mind, Eldritch Sight, Eyes of the Runekeeper, Fiendish Vigor, Gaze of Two Minds, Mask of Many Faces, and Misty Visions. And a lot of these are just obviously not a good deal. One of the most clear examples to demonstrate is Beguiling Influence, which gives you 2 skill proficiencies, while the Skilled feat, which isn't a good feat, gives you 3 proficiencies. So it's easy to see how this would be a terrible choice. Still, I can see certain situations where these might be worthwhile. For example, let's say I'm playing an Abjurer. I could grab Armor of Shadows, and that gives me the ability to cast Mage Armor at will, and I could use that to refresh my Arcane Ward without requiring multiclassing. An Eldritch Knight is usually stuck with Darkness at 2nd level because it's an evocation spell, but it becomes a much better spell if you also have Devil's Sight. And of course, fighters have more ability score increases, which means they can grab more feats. The other time I could see taking this feat is if I'm grabbing a bit of Warlock. For example, if I maybe was playing a Bard and I dipped 1 level of Warlock because Bards don't get any good attack cantrips, and I wanted one. However, 2 levels of Warlock puts my spell progression behind significantly, so I maybe don't want to invest that 2nd level of Warlock. But 1 level means Eldritch Blast is not delivering good damage, so it's probably not worth the 1 level investment. But if I dip just 1 level, and then I grab this feat for Agonizing Blast, that might be a decent compromise. So I'm not rushing into this feat, but I could see it for certain builds. Again, I think that lands it in the orange territory, though I think it's at least purple adjacent. Our next full feat is Fighting Initiate. This is one that's probably overdue. The Fighting Initiate feat provides you a fighting style option from the fighter list. The options are, you could take archery, get +2 to hit with ranged weapons. Defensive gives you +1 to armor class, as long as you're wearing armor. Dueling can give you +2 damage with one-handed weapons. Great weapon fighting, which is not very good and definitely not worth a feat. Protection, which gives a reaction option for shield wearers to protect an ally. Two-weapon fighting, so that second weapon gains your ability score bonus to damage. And the new ones in Tasha's. Blind fighting for 10-foot blind sight. Interception, which is probably a better version of protection, at least at low levels. Superior technique to get a battle master maneuver. Thrown weapon fighting, which is almost a must for these kinds of builds. And unarmed fighting. Most of these I don't think are worth the feat. +2 damage with your one-handed weapon is fine if you're playing a one-handed fighter, but it's not so good it's feat level good. A +1 armor class is good on every character, period. Again though, I don't think it's worth a feat. There are some of these though that are feat level good. The first and most obvious is archery. If you are playing an archery character and you don't have access to this fighting style because you're not a fighter or a ranger, then I can totally see this feat being a good investment. Blind fighting is another one I could see taking this for, especially if you have someone in your group, maybe even you, who has the notion to cast fog spells. Though if they're into darkness spells instead, I would suggest getting Devil's Sight through Eldritch Adept instead. Now if you must play a monk, unarmed fighting is probably a good feat for you, because sadly fighters are better at that too now. Eventually a martial arts style will catch up, and at that point you can switch this off to another option. Maybe defense, thrown weapon fighting, or archery. So I can see this as a decent option for enough builds that I think it deserves a purple rank. I should also add in that I don't think this one is worth it if you already have a fighting style to grab a second one. Fighting styles, like pretty much anything else in this game, provide diminishing returns if you keep going back to the well. The next full feat we're going to talk about is Metamagic Adept. Now this one is interesting. You get 2 metamagic options from the sorcerer class and 2 sorcery points to spend on them. You can also trade these out for other options as your character progresses through the ability score increase levels. I've been asked about this one quite a few times now, and the question usually goes something like, obviously Metamagic Adept doesn't give enough sorcery points for non-sorcerers, but if you are a sorcerer, do you think it's worth it? So to answer the question, yes, I think this is a pretty good feat for sorcerers. Sorcerers do not get enough metamagic options, and although they can trade them with Tasha's, more options would be excellent, and 2 additional sorcery points is not nothing either. Now I don't think this is the first feat I would be picking. I mean, I would be boosting concentration first, but I could see grabbing it at some point. However, I also want to refute the assumption that seems to be prevalent, and that's that this isn't a worthwhile feat for non-sorcerers. If I'm a primary spellcaster, I want this feat. My choices are pretty easy. Number 1, give me Subtle Spell. Number 2, probably Extend Spell, though a Warlock or Bard might consider Careful Spell. Subtle Spell is great, and 2 Subtle Spells per day, I mean, sign me up. Remember that a spellcast with Subtle Spell metamagic cannot be counterspelled, as they need to see you casting a spell. I mean, that alone is worth the feat. Also, does my 17th level Warlock want to extend Foresight? You bet. Does my Bard want to apply Careful Spell to Hypnotic Pattern? I'm sure they do. Metamagic doesn't need to cost a lot of sorcery points for it to be good. I mean, even when I play a sorcerer, I tend to be drawn to the cheap options. So yeah, I think this is a pretty good feat for any character that is focused on spellcasting. Now again, I'm not taking it before Warcaster or anything like that, but eventually I want to get it. I would go so far as to say this is a green ranking, in my opinion. So that brings us to our next full feat, which is Poisoner. The Poisoner feat gives us 3 benefits. The first is you ignore poison damage resistance. This unfortunately sounds better than it is. The problem with poison damage isn't resistance, it's immunity, and a lot of creatures are immune to poison damage. The second benefit is that you can apply poison as a bonus action. This means you could potentially apply, then deliver poison attacks every round. This, however, is going to use up your bonus action, so it doesn't play nicely with Crossbow Expert, Polearm Master, Hunter's Mark spells, two-weapon fighting, or the other bonus action options that martial characters may have. And the third benefit is you gain the proficiency with the Poisoner's Kit, and you can make your own poison. This poison has a DC of 14, it delivers 2d8 damage, and the poison condition for a round. This poison isn't free though. It's going to cost you 50 gold pieces for a couple doses, and you're going to get a few more doses as your level goes up. And I have to say, when we combine all three abilities, I almost like this feat. It's just not quite there for me. The bonus action to apply hurts a bit, but on the other hand, it is doable. I mean, I could make an archer with a longbow, and I can have that bonus action available. And if I can do an additional 2d8 damage plus the poison condition on a failed save, that's probably worth a bonus action, I think. And the poison itself is pretty cool, and at low levels it's actually pretty good damage and a condition boost. The DC not scaling though is a bit of an issue, and tougher monsters are unlikely to fail that saving throw. I mean, we get to the point where you get things like adult red dragons, they don't even need to make a roll, they're automatically going to save. At lower levels though, that 50 gold piece cost is going to make this very hard to afford. That means unless your DM is really nice about letting you harvest poisons, I wouldn't always expect to have a poison available for use, which would be devastating if you invested a feat specifically for that purpose. The biggest issue I have with this though is my issue with all poison damage options, and that's that there's a fair number of combats where you're just not going to be able to use this. Undead are all immune to poison, and undead come up in D&D a lot. Demons too, and they're immune as well. That said, I wouldn't go as far as to say I would never take this feat. If I was in a campaign where I had reason to expect our regular combat challenges were against foes that were not immune to poison, and we had a pretty decent cash flow for our characters, then I could see throwing this on maybe a ranger with a longbow, for example. But I would say that's circumstantial enough that orange is the right ranking here. And that concludes all the full feats in Tasha's. As I mentioned before though, where Tasha's really shines is our extensive half feat options. So let's start with our first half feat, Chef. This is going to allow us to apply a +1 to Wisdom or Constitution. And although Constitution is good on any character, it's really never our primary ability score, except maybe with some barbarian builds. So mainly I'd be looking at this more with something like a cleric or a druid. We're getting 3 abilities along with the +1 ability score boost. The first is proficiency with cook's utensils. Tool proficiency is a pretty small thing, so no big benefit there. The second is you can create special food, starting with 6 servings and eventually gets up to 10 servings. This adds a d8 to a short rest healing. It's basically a more limited version of a bard's Song of Rest. And to be honest, Song of Rest is not why I play a bard. It's a pretty small ability, and so is this. Still, it's not terrible, and you will get to use it. The third is you can create a couple treats after the long rest that require a bonus action to consume for a couple temporary hit points. This eventually will become 6 temporary hit points and 6 treats. Now, we need to put this one in perspective. At levels 1 through 4, this provides a total of 4 temporary hit points each day. At levels 5 through 8, that becomes 9 temporary hit points each day. If we compare this to pretty much anything else in the game that provides temporary hit points, it's really almost nothing. Inspiring Leader, for example, that's going to be providing 20 or so temporary hit points every short rest right at level 1. And as I mentioned earlier in this video, a half feat's benefit should be probably about half as good as a whole feat. And Chef just isn't there. Also, with the other feats in this book, if you want a +1 Wisdom half feat, there are lots of great options, which makes this even worse in comparison. I would go far to say that this is probably the worst feat in this book. On the other hand, it's far from the worst feat in the game, as there are some bad feats out there. I mean, it's probably not even the worst half feat in the game either. So I may be generous here, but I'm going to rank this orange, but it is on the cusp of being red. Second half feat I'm going to talk about is Crusher. And I can say first off, there's no feat in Tasha's I've seen played more than the Crusher feat. Players making martial characters are really drawn to this one, and I can see why. You can choose Strength or Constitution for your ability score bonus, and I would expect most of the time that's going to be Strength. Throwing this on a melee martial works quite well with a maul. That said, there are some options for using this at range 2, in which case Constitution is still going to be an okay option. You're getting 2 additional benefits with this feat. The first is, when you hit a creature with an attack that does bludgeoning damage, you can move it 5 feet in any direction, as long as the creature is not more than 1 size larger than you. This is the feature that has players grabbing this one. There are a lot of nice control options here, whether it's knocking creatures into webs, or spirit guardians, or the like, but there's actually another option here I've seen used, and that is to knock a creature upwards. The version I've seen is with the Genie Warlock and the Dao Patron, using their bludgeoning shot with Eldritch Blast to knock a creature diagonally 5 feet up, and then towards them. And then they blast the creature with Repelling Blast to send it flying upwards diagonally in the other direction. So once you're done, it's over 10 feet in the air, so now it's going to fall, it's going to take damage, and it's going to land prone. So this feature is pretty effective, and you can use it every round. It doesn't use up any resources. The second is, when you score a critical hit, any following attack rolls against that creature are made with advantage until your next turn. This one is the smaller benefit, but it's okay. Now we see 3 kinds of these feats that specialize in a certain weapon damage type. Of those 3, this one I think is the best, and I think it's worthy of a green ranking. The next half feat I'm going to talk about is Fey Touched. So this one has some good versatility off the bat, as you can boost any of your mental scores, whether it's Intelligence, Wisdom, or Charisma. For the feature, you get 2 spells you can cast without expending a spell slot. One of them is Misty Step, which is a 2nd level spell, and it's a good 2nd level spell. The other is a 1st level enchantment or divination spell of your choice. This gives a lot of options that are pretty good. You could take Bless, Dissonant Whispers. If you're playing with Dunamancy, you could take Gift of Alacrity. There's Hex, there's Hideous Laughter, there's Hunter's Mark. Both of the free spells are also available to be cast with your regular spell slots. The spellcasting ability used is the one you raised with this feat, leading to some unusual combos, like maybe a Wisdom-based Tasha's Hideous Laughter, or an Intelligence-based Dissonant Whispers. Whatever it ends up being, this is just an amazing deal. Think about Magic Initiate for a second. That gives you 1 1st level spell and 2 cantrips, and that's a full feat. This is way better than half as good as that. In fact, you could make the argument it's better than that. So as far as half feats go, I think this is about as good as it gets. And it's right on the cusp between green and blue, and I think just enough that I'm going to give this a blue ranking. The next half feat I'm going to talk about is Gunner. Now this one is really not an option in a lot of campaigns, as the firearms rules are optional, and firearms just aren't a thing in a lot of campaign settings. However, if they are, Gunner will give you a +1 dexterity and 3 additional features. First, you're going to get proficiency with firearms. This is pretty important, since unless your DM gives you proficiency, none of the base classes start with it. Secondly, you will ignore the loading property of firearms. This again is important since, unless modern or futuristic firearms are available, you will be dealing with the loading property. And if you're planning to specialize in guns, good chance you'll be getting extra attack. Third, you're going to be able to fire within 5 feet of an enemy without disadvantage. So this feature, just like the Crossbow Expert feature, that does the same thing. So if you want to get into guns, this is the feat. It's going to give you that necessary proficiency, allow you to do what you need to do in order to go down this road. You're also going to need Sharpshooter at some point as well, and I'm not sure this is better than Crossbow Expert and a hand crossbow, but if guns are an option, this isn't a bad way to go with a ranged build. And because this is a half feat, it actually means you can get to that Dexterity 18 earlier than if you were going with Crossbow Expert and Sharpshooter. Speaking of which, if you were ever considering taking the Crossbow Expert feat just for the ability to fire within 5 feet of an enemy without the disadvantage, you should take this feat instead, because it's a half feat, so you're also going to get a +1 ability score boost in addition to that benefit. Now, obviously, if you're using a crossbow, you still want Crossbow Expert, but if it's just about the firing within 5 feet of an enemy, then Gunner is the better choice, because it's giving you that same benefit with only the expense of a half feat. And overall, I think this is just a decent option and very solid purple. The next half feat I'm going to talk about is Piercer. This is our next damage type specialization, and Piercer allows you to increase your strength or dexterity by 1, which is good because finesse weapons tend to be piercing. You're going to get 2 additional features here. The first one is once per turn, when you hit a creature with a piercing attack, you can re-roll a damage die. Now for a lot of piercing weapons, like hand crossbows and daggers, this just isn't going to be that much. But if you maybe are using a lance, this could be a pretty decent boost. The second is that when you score a critical hit, you can roll an additional damage die, which once again is a lot better with certain kinds of weapons. For the most part, I find that characters who specialize in piercing weapons are not using big damage dice. Maybe a D8 for rapiers and longbows, but probably even more likely a D6. And they're just not going to get all that much from this feat. Now, if I'm making a mounted lance build, this is something I might consider, as re-rolling and adding D12s is a lot more potent. Now, if I end up in a position where I can choose either this or Elven Accuracy, I'm probably going for the latter. But I should mention that unlike the other damage type specialties, there is a better chance that this one can be combined with multiple weapon builds, like the ranger who goes from longbow to rapier. So instead of applying it just to one weapon, you might be applying it to multiple weapons. This one though, overall, I think it's okay, and I think purple is about right. The next half feat I want to talk about is Shadow Touched. This half feat is very similar to Fey Touched. We have the same 3 ability boost options, but instead of Misty Step, we get Invisibility, and our first level spell option can be from Illusion or Necromancy. Now, Invisibility is a decent spell, and it's hard to compare it directly to Misty Step because they do very different things, but I will say that when I'm playing spellcasters, a lot more of them are going to be having Misty Step than Invisibility. When it comes to first level spells though, our list here is way smaller, and we just have less good options. In fact, the only spell I think I would be really considering here is Silent Image, and Silent Image is a perfectly serviceable spell, but there just aren't a lot of options beyond that. So I just don't think this is quite as good as Fey Touched in my opinion, since I think Misty Step is the better second level spell, and there are so many more first level options. This doesn't make this a bad option though, not by any means, it's still a good option. I mean, there just happens to be another that's probably better. This is still green though, as a free second level spell and first level spell is just really good for a half feat. The next feat I'm looking at is Skill Expert, again a half feat. This is probably the easiest one to rank for me. And the first thing I like here is that this is a half feat that's going to fit on any character looking for a half feat. You can increase any ability score. You can get any skill proficiency and any skill expertise. Any character in the game can use that. Also, when we look at full feats that provide skill proficiencies like Skilled or Prodigy, this one is providing a very comparable benefit despite being a half feat. So I'd be taking this over either of those almost every time. In the end, this feat is so easy to rank, it is as purple as can be. It's decent. It's pretty much always going to be decent. It's never a must-have, but it's never a terrible option. Absolutely, totally purple. The next half feat I'm going to look at is Slasher. This is the last of the damage type specialties. Again, we can choose from strength or dexterity. I think there's a better chance this will be strength, as we're probably talking melee here. Although scimitar, I guess, is finesse. Or there's the Revenant Blade options, I suppose, as well. Like with the other damage type specialties, we're getting 2 features here. The first is you can reduce the speed of an enemy you hit by 10 feet. This is okay, but it's also pretty common. Ray of Frost does this, some of the summons in this book do this, Lance of Lethargy does this, the Fathom Warlock does this. 10-foot slowdown is actually becoming quite regular. We should also note that your slashing weapon is likely melee. Movement penalties are not quite as good as they are if you are doing a ranged attack, where you can potentially keep that opponent at range. So if this ability to reduce speed by 10 feet was on something like piercing weapons, I'd be more drawn to it than on slashing weapons. Still, coming in with a glaive and attacking at reach, then backing away to a point where maybe they can't return the favor, could be a decent combat tactic. Or maybe you're just protecting the backliners. The second feature is that when you score a critical hit, the creature gets disadvantage on attack rolls until your next turn. This one I like a lot. If you are concentrating your attacks on the big bad, good chance this will end up being a bigger benefit than giving your allies advantage like Crusher, or that extra damage die from Piercer. I should also mention that, at least from personal experience, if you're counting on a magic weapon drop in a published adventure, I find slashing weapons just tend to be the most common. Long swords, axes, great swords, there's just a better chance to come across these, in my experience, than, say, a magic maul. Still, nothing here compares to the movement option from Crusher, but, like with Piercer, I think this is okay, especially for a half feat, and it's worth a purple rank. The next half feat I'm going to talk about is Telekinetic, another option that can improve any of our mental ability scores. As a player who was used to looking at Keen Mind or Observant over and over, I'm feeling spoiled. So this one is quite a bit different. We aren't getting leveled spells with this one. We get a cantrip. The cantrip is Mage Hand. If we already have Mage Hand, we get twice the range. We can cast it with no components, and it's invisible. The second feature is the big one. We get a bonus action push we can use every round. We can move a willing ally 5 feet or an enemy 5 feet if they fail a strength saving throw. This movement must be towards or away from you. They also have to be within 30 feet of you. So here's the question you want to ask yourself when you're considering this feat, and that is, what are you doing with your bonus action? If the answer is something, this feat is not the feat for you. If the answer is normally nothing, then this is something definitely to consider. However, if you are in an extended campaign, consider the future as well. Telekinetic on a 4th level wizard might sound great, but if you're planning on using Bigby's Hand or animated objects later on, they're not going to pair well with this feat. Still, I think enough builds can get decent use out of this. I think it squeaks out a green ranking, though probably on the purple side of green. Now, I recently used this feat. I threw it on a sorcerer I was playing for a one-shot, and I found it quite good. And that brings us to our next half feat, which is Telepathic. This is the final feat out of Tasha's. Like with so many others, this feat lets us choose any of our mental ability scores for an increase. Right away, this means this feat is in some pretty heavy competition, as Fey Touched, Shadow Touched, and Telekinetic are all good feats. We get 2 abilities with this one. The first is Telepathic Communication. This telepathy has a 60-foot range, it doesn't bypass language restrictions, and it doesn't allow for responses. That makes it among the weaker of the various telepathic options in the game. Speaking of which, there are a lot of telepathic options in this game now. Great Old One actually felt pretty special in the player's handbook, but now you got Ghostwise Halflings, Aberrant Sorcerers, Soul Knife Rogues. It's just not that unique anymore. The second feature is you can cast the Detect Thoughts spell once per day for free. So Detect Thoughts is an okay spell, but it's definitely circumstantial, and it's not a spell I would expect to be casting every day. That means of the half feats this competes with, among Misty Step, Invisibility, and Detect Thoughts, this is the one that excites me the least. Now it's interesting that if Fey Touched, Shadow Touched, and Telekinetic were not in this book, I'd be pretty darned excited by this feat. But considering the other options, this one comes in last. That said, I can't say this isn't a decent half feat. It is a decent half feat. There's just really good feats it's in competition with, so I still think this one does rank purple. And overall, I still think this is a decent feat, but if I am looking to boost my wisdom, my intelligence, or my charisma by 1, and I'm looking at the feats in this book, this is just not going to be my top consideration. So that's it. That's all the feats in Tasha's. There are a lot of decent feats here, and a lot of decent or good half feats. And I should also note that with 15 feats, having none of them end up being red is pretty cool. Though again, I may have been generous to Chef. I should also note that if you use the custom lineage option in Tasha's, taking a half feat gives you the ability to start off with an 18 in your primary ability score, on top of getting one of several pretty good half feat options. This is going to be a great way to go for a lot of character builds. So yeah, I'm pretty happy with the feats in Tasha's. Lots of good options. There's few bad options. Nothing is outrageous in either direction. And it's just a really nice list. So I hope this analysis is of use to you. Let me know what you think of these feats down below. If there's any that stick out to you as must-tries. On Monday's video, I'm going to be doing a shorter video, and I'm just going to discuss some of the weird outcomes of playing on a grid and what we can do to address it. Then next week, I'm going to do something I rarely do, and I'm going to be talking about a recent Unearthed Arcana release. Wizards has released Unearthed Arcana with some lineage options, as well as some guidelines that lineages and races will follow in the future. And I have a couple cents to throw into this discussion, which I hope you'll join me for. After that, we'll get right back to Tasha's optional class features and subclasses. So until then, I'm going to sit back, relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks everyone. Talk to you soon.